Good afternoon, everyone. What a true delight to be here. So I may live and work in New York, but this is home, and it is always a special treat when I have the chance to speak in Helsinki. So let's talk about tech regulation. There is globally not only a race to develop technologies and pursue that very desirable supremacy in technology. There is also a race to regulate technology. There's now increasingly globally a consensus that technology needs rules, but there is no consensus on what those rules ought to look like. I think it is helpful to think about three primary ways to govern technology. We have the American market-driven regulatory model, we have the Chinese state-driven model, and we have the European, what I call a rights-driven regulatory model. So let me just walk you through the basic assumptions underlying each of these competing paradigms. So the American market-driven model really prioritizes free market, free speech, free internet, incentives to innovate. The government is reserved only a trivial role, and the governance of technology is basically handed over to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of the world. Chinese think about technology somewhat differently. So the Chinese government is very focused on making China a technological superpower. And under its state-driven regulatory model, it is prepared to deploy state resources to reach that goal. But China is also deploying technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to entrench the political power of the Communist Party and ensure social stability within the nation. So in this conversation, the Europeans are often described as being forced to choose between those two alternative worlds, the American and the Chinese digital world, lacking a robust technology sector on its own. But I don't think the Europeans can make that choice. And I don't think they have to make that choice. The Chinese model for the Europeans is simply too oppressive. But the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have pioneered their own third way forward. They have pursued this human-centric digital transformation where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and a pursuit of a more fair digital transformation takes the center stage. So the Europeans are prepared to transfer power away from the largest platforms to smaller tech companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So these are the three fundamental models and three leading technology and regulatory powers. But why would I call these three empires? Empire is a big word. It is a provocative word, but I use it partially metaphorically, but also for a reason. Because I think it helps us understand what is going on. Because none of these three regulatory models are confined to the countries and jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each empire is proactively exporting its respective regulatory model abroad, and in that process, expanding its relative sphere of influence. But what is interesting to me, they're all exporting something different. So the Americans are mainly exporting the private power of their formidable tech companies. The US tech companies were set free to take over the world, and that is exactly what they have done. Users around the world are using the products and services of US tech companies, and by doing so, they are being shaped by these techno-libertarian ideas that are embedded into those products. So if I take one example of Meta's Facebook, the company has over 3 billion users in over 160 countries. That is part of the American digital empire. Chinese are mainly exporting what I call infrastructure power. Chinese tech companies are building 5G networks, undersea cables, data centers, smart cities, safe cities, exporting surveillance technologies along the digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Latin America, Africa, and even parts of Europe. And by then exporting those surveillance technologies, they are expanding the reach of the Chinese digital authoritarian regulatory regime. So what are the Europeans exporting? They are exporting the superpower that the Europeans have, which is regulation. Europeans are more famous for regulating than generating technologies. And I will return to that in a moment. But the Europeans are known for what I've called the Brussels effect, a term that describes the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, these companies need to abide by European regulations. That is not surprising if they adopt those European regulations in order to do business in Europe. But often they conclude that it is in their business interest to apply the European regulation across their global production and global conduct because they want to avoid the cost of producing different products for different markets. So simply by regulating the single market, the European rules, the European regulatory digital empire gets often expanded across the global marketplace. So if the first thing I wanted to persuade you on is that the Europeans are also an empire, the second argument is that we don't really see the global digital world splintering into three separate spheres of influence. Instead, those spheres of influence are often overlapping. You have many markets around the world where you, at the same time, have the presence of US tech companies, the Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations regulating those companies and that infrastructure, which then also means that those empires are often coming into conflict. And then we observe various conflicts around the world. And we mainly see two types of conflicts. We see horizontal conflicts and vertical conflicts. The horizontal conflicts are the conflicts between the empires themselves. The most predominant one being the US-China tech war. That is the battle for technological supremacy, economic, ideological, geopolitical, and one day, potentially even military supremacy. That battle has really cast a shadow over the global digital economy, and it has geopoliticized the use of technology. It has shifted the way the US behaves, and it has shifted the way Europe behaves. We've seen a move towards export controls, investment restrictions. We see subsidy races. Increasingly, you see the Americans and Europeans playing Beijing's game, a game that Beijing is much more accustomed to playing. But we are seeing a move towards those restrictions that is really partially decoupling the global digital economy. It's also presenting many challenges for global companies that are navigating the American market-driven model and the Chinese state-driven model. So consider Google, that was so tempted to offer its search engine in China. But if it was to do so, that needed to be made consistent with the Chinese Communist Party's censorship regime. So the search results would look very different. And Google tried to do that. But the backlash was fierce. Because in the US, the employees, the shareholders, and also the members of Congress were accusing Google of capitulating to the Chinese censorship regime, which led Google to ultimately withdraw from the Chinese market. That's not the only horizontal battle we are seeing. We are witnessing another horizontal battle as the battle between the US and Europe, and that is primarily a regulatory battle. The American companies have come to Europe and are increasingly, what European thinks, taking too much and giving too little. They are abusing the vast dominance that they have in the marketplace, making the European market less competitive. They are infringing the fundamental right to privacy of the Europeans by engaging in extensive surveillance capitalism and even potentially transferring that European data to the use of American national security agencies. And the Europeans are now trying to push back and assert their regulatory powers. Extensive array of digital regulations are emanating from Brussels, enforcement actions against US tech companies, which has led then Americans to say that, look, it's not our companies that are overreaching, it's your regulators that are overreaching. So that is the second horizontal battle that we observe. But we are also observing what I call vertical battles. And these are the battles between governments and tech companies. And this is the battle that the Europeans have been leading. But the Europeans are no longer alone. Increasingly, governments around the world are engaging in that vertical battle, asserting their regulatory authority in an effort to take back control and regulate their digital economies. The Chinese have recently gone through a massive crackdown of the tech sector. Americans, even they are now having second thoughts on the benefits of techno-libertarian ideas. There are bills pending in Congress that are now suggesting that the Americans need to revive their antitrust laws, adopt a federal privacy law, regulate artificial intelligence, do something about the free speech that leaves now Americans vulnerable to extensive array of disinformation and hate speech. But the difficulty, especially for Americans, with this vertical battle is that it always intersects with that horizontal battle. Those conversations unfold in the shadow of the intensive tech war against China. And Americans are determined to prevail in that war. So they cannot be too ambitious in looking to rein in their tech companies, because those companies are the US's very asset against China. So they cannot be weakened, which is why the US always will remain somewhat more hesitant in regulating technology. So let me now move to the question that probably interests most of you, which is, what happens in these battles? Who wins the horizontal battle, and who wins the vertical battle? So let me offer you a couple of predictions. My first prediction is that the American market-driven model is losing. Its appeal is waning abroad and also at home. There's increasingly a sense that the digital economy cannot be governed by tech companies themselves. The market-driven model may have been apt to govern technology at the heyday of the early years of internet revolution, but today it can no longer do that. Even the US, as I mentioned, is now walking away from many of those commitments. So in many ways, that's good news for the Europeans, because that means that a growing number of governments are now coalescing behind the EU and adopting a variation of its rights-driven regulatory model, taking the view that it's the European model that best protects the fundamental right to privacy, advances the public interest, protects democracy, and achieves a sense of fairness, an inclusive digital transformation. But I have three concerns about the European model that may dim any victory that the Europeans might be ultimately being able to declare. My first concern is this. There is general admiration of the benefits of the European model, but there is serious hesitation on whether that model is consistent with innovation. So when I ask a room full of people, this is a sophisticated audience, but often when you ask a room full of people to name a European tech company, it sometimes takes them a while. But they are very quick to name the GDPR. So the Europeans are not known for being the hotbed of developing technologies. And there is a massive gap between the prominence of American tech companies and European tech companies. So I do worry about European innovation, but I don't think the European rights-driven regulatory model and its commitment to technology regulation is where the problem lies. Instead, I think there are much more fundamental reasons that explain why the US is doing so much better than the Europeans. So let me give you 4 reasons that I believe are much more important than in explaining the US-EU technology gap. First, there is no digital single market in Europe. The markets remain fragmented across linguistic lines. There are differences in consumer preferences and expectations, and there are legal differences that are costly to overcome. So it is much harder for a tech company to scale across the fragmented European market in Europe, not the problem US tech companies face. The second issue is that there is no deep integrated capital markets union in Europe. It is much harder for the tech companies to raise money to fund their innovations in Europe. They do pretty well in the first few funding rounds, but as soon as they need more money, they need to turn to US tech giants that acquire them, or they need to get venture capital primarily from the United States. Third is bankruptcy laws and general attitudes towards failure in Europe. You need to let the entrepreneurs take risks, which means you need to let them fail and give them a second chance to try again. Europe has some of the most punitive bankruptcy laws in the world, and it is often fatal to fail in Europe. There's also a different attitude towards risk, whereas there's stigma associated with failure in Europe. In the US, it's built into the venture capital model. It's like a rite of passage. You try very hard, you occasionally fail, then you go and raise more money, and they give you more money because it seems like you're working on big things. And that also needs to change. Fourth, and I think this is really important, you cannot be the world's leading innovator unless you have access to the world's leading innovators. And the US has done a much better job than the Europeans in attracting the world's best talent to innovate for the benefit of American tech industry. So if you think about over $1 billion startups in the US, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. If we focus for a moment in just the household name tech companies and their founders, Steve Jobs of Apple, son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Amazon, second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk of Tesla, South African. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, is Brazilian. And I could go on. This is not the story that because the Europeans have adopted regulations like the GDPR, the Europeans cannot succeed in regulating technology. And it's not that if the Europeans decided now to walk away from the newly adopted AI Act, that suddenly 5 years from now, all the AI companies would emanate from Europe. It will not happen unless the Europeans remain equally committed to building those other pillars of the tech ecosystem as they have been, in my view, rightfully also building the regulations. So this is also my message to the Americans, that if the Americans were to adopt a federal privacy law, that would not dismantle the US capital markets. That would not rewrite the bankruptcy laws. And that would not prevent the immigrants from coming to the United States and succeed there. So I want to decouple this idea that there's an inevitable negative correlation between the European approach to regulating technology and the country's and sector's ability to innovate and thrive. So I'm much more worried about the second issue, which may dim the victory of the European model, and that is that the Europeans are not regulating enough. They are regulating too little. And in particular, I'm worried about them not implementing and enforcing their regulations. There's been many, many antitrust cases against Google, over 10 billion in fines. What has happened to Google's market share? Pretty much nothing. We have the GDPR, but the breaches of data privacy are commonplace all the time, and it's well understood that the GDPR has not been enough implemented. And we see constantly the Europeans needing to worry about being surrounded by hate speech and disinformation online. So the implementation of those ambitious regulations remains a major task for the Europeans. Otherwise, it's a hollow victory. And in practice, it is the American model that prevails. The third challenge for the Europeans is China. The European model may be doing really well in the democratic world, but it has very little traction in the authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning world. And that world is getting bigger every day. So these countries, they look at China and China's state-driven model, and they like what they see. And let me give you 2 reasons why it is quite difficult for the Europeans, Americans, or any other techno-democracy to persuade these authoritarian or developing countries not to follow China. So first, is the significance of that infrastructure power. These countries need path to digital development, and China is providing them one. The Chinese infrastructure is pretty good, and it's affordable. And the Europeans are not in a position to provide them an alternative that they can afford. A second, and I'm really uncomfortable saying this, but I think it needs to be said because it happens to be true. China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have created a thriving tech economy without being free. So it is very hard for us to go to those countries and say, you choose to follow China, and all you get is control, but you will never see innovation, you will never see economic growth. They look at China, and they say, well, it seems that I can have both. So I think we need to be mindful in that horizontal battle against China of those narratives, and think about how to counter those narratives, and how to persuade those countries that are swing states, if you like, to then follow the European model as well. So now let me end with the biggest battle of all. The biggest battle, as I see, facing us in the coming years, even today, is the battle over the future of liberal democracy. And I want to invite you to think that that battle in the digital space can be lost in one of 2 ways. One is if the EU and US and their techno-democratic allies indeed lose that horizontal battle to China, and the world is turning more digital authoritarian. And I've offered some reasons why we cannot take it for granted that the techno-democracies would win that fight. But I also want you to think that that battle for liberal democracy can be lost if the EU and the US lose the vertical battle to tech companies, and the world is governed by those companies and not democratic governments. That is also not consistent with liberal democracy. And that can also happen. American Congress is so deeply paralyzed that they are hardly capable of passing any meaningful legislation. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't have a hard time legislating. If China decides it's time to crack down on big tech, it is time to crack down on the big tech. The Europeans have been able to legislate, but the Europeans have had a hard time enforcing. Again, the Chinese government doesn't have a hard time enforcing. If China brings a case against Alibaba, Alibaba does not drag the Chinese government to some independent court for a decade. In Europe, they do that, and they do it for a reason, because we have rule of law, and we have all those rights that we take seriously. But we also need to be able to show to ourselves and to the world that there is an effective liberal democratic way to govern technology. Otherwise, we are forced to conclude that digital economies either governed by the authoritarians, whereas democratic governments are destined to fail in that endeavor, or it is governed by tech companies. And neither is good for liberal democracy, because that would lead to the conclusion that true digital empires are either the authoritarians or the tech companies. So I'm going to leave you with this. Consider it my battle cry or your call to action. But we have different digital futures awaiting us. I don't believe in techno-determinism. Those choices have not been made, but they are in the process of being made. And it is up to us to make the changes and the choices in a way that we will shape the coming AI revolution and other technological developments and shape the future of our digital society. So it really depends on the choices that we face as governments, as tech companies, as investors, as individual users of technology, whether technology will exploit and control us, or whether we ultimately are in charge of shaping and deploying that technology for the benefit of humanity. And that will determine whether technology will ultimately undermine or whether it will support and revitalize our democracies. So I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great conference.